Welcome to Human Monsters. Part 1. John George High. John George High was born in Stanford, Lincolnshire, England, on July 24, 1909. He spent most of his childhood in the village of Outwood, located close to West Riding, Yorkshire. His parents, John, Robert, and Emily, were fanatically religious. They were members of a group called the Plymouth Brethren. They were referred to as the peculiar people by some. They were Protestant and very conservative. His father built a 10-foot wall around their estate. He did this to keep the outside world from infiltrating their inner sanctum. John Sr. acted like he was appointed by God personally to watch over his family, to ensure no kind of nastiness was going on. He wanted to ensure nobody was doing anything with their genitals that they shouldn't. And who would want to with their father breathing down their necks anyway? Their religion was anti-clerical and purist, so much so that social entertainment of every kind was strictly banned. John Jr. was not even allowed to play sports. All he could do at home to whittle away the time was listen to Bible stories and play the piano. It was an exceedingly boring and lonely childhood for Jr. Despite his quest to establish a standard of decency, Sr. told Jr. that a bluish blemish on his head was the mark of a sinner. He had been a rebellious youth. Jr. was young enough to believe it, and he became terrified that he, too, would bear such a mark. His mother was not cursed with such a spot, and he viewed her as almost angelic. Growing up in such a household, with the threats of eternal damnation and earthbound tortures, resulted in Jr. having nightmares. He would dream of trees morphing into blood-dripping crucifixes and other morbid specters. Jr. owned pets, and, unlike many other serial killers, he treated them well. Jr. was seldom disciplined, but it was, nevertheless, known to happen on occasion. His mother beat him with a hairbrush until the bristles drew blood. He would lick the blood off. He savored that salty, coppery flavor. This was all it took to activate a thirst for blood that would dog him years later. By the time John was 16 years old, he had defied his parents by engaging in many activities they deemed to be sinful. Masturbating furiously assumed to be among them. Oddly enough, they permitted him to do whatever it was they were aware of. As a result, he knew, by that point, that his father's blue blemish threat was an empty one. Now that he knew he could engage in transgressive behavior without that kind of consequence, he would continue down the path to decadence and depravity. John developed a gift of gab that enabled him to talk his way in and out of anything by saying whatever the other party wanted to hear. In other words, having recognized manipulation as an art form and a skill that could be learned, he was eager to learn and apply it. This became a well-honed craft for him, and soon he was a highly skilled liar, with little concern for the impact on the victim. John was remembered as an intelligent and capable student. At the end of every school day, he would race home to avoid being tripped up by the nefarious entities his father was always warning him about. He performed so well academically that he was awarded with 2 scholarships. He became a choir boy and put his skills as a pianist and organist to good use at school. After John graduated from secondary school, he didn't pursue a career in the military, which was common among young British men in those days. Like many serial killers, John High couldn't stay in one position for long and drifted from one job to another. Some were typical working-class jobs, but he always earned money illegally from fraudulent schemes. One legitimate pursuit enabled him to indulge his love of automobiles, an apprenticeship at a motor engineering firm. He only lasted a year. He hated getting dirty, and such is a fact of life when you're working with oily and dirt-encrusted machinery. His next foray into legitimate employment was as a clerk at Wakefield Education Community. Whatever he did there, and it likely entailed filling in forms and other such uninspired procedures, he found it tiresome after a while and resigned. Soon after, he became an underwriter for insurance and advertising companies. He was proficient in this role, and it enabled him to buy an expensive car he had been coveting. 1934. Some pivotal events happened in the life of John George High at this time. He stopped attending church, despite his parents' protests. He had been fired from one of his jobs due to embezzlement. It was about this time that the criminal in him was beginning to take root and would soon blossom. John High met 21-year-old Beatrice Betty Hammer. I wish my surname was Hammer. They married soon after getting acquainted. John was a silver-tongued devil, and he was always nattily dressed. He gave Betty the impression that he was more successful than he actually was. She was a highly independent woman and high-spirited. She was discerning enough to wonder if John was as successful as he claimed to be. His financial situation was nebulous to the casual observer, and she was still uncertain as to what he lived on and how he procured it. Despite her misgivings, she married him on July 6, 1934. Once they were married, they moved into John's parents' house. Living with your in-laws would be trying enough, but dealing with their religiosity would have been barely tolerable. John was sick of working for others, so he started his own business. The service he provided entailed forging documents for automobiles, though that was not how he described it to clients or Betty. In October 1934, he was caught engaging in these activities and was arrested. He was sentenced to 15 months in prison. By November that year, Betty had left him and filed for divorce. While he was in prison, Betty gave birth to a girl and put her up for adoption. When John was released from prison, he returned to his parents' home. He started a dry cleaning business with a partner and remained in this position for a time. The business was successful and John prospered. This prosperity was short-lived. His business partner was killed in a motorcycle accident and the business was liquidated. John was bitter about this turn of events. John's criminal history and his failed marriage had been a point of shame for his parents, and they were fed up with him. He soon moved to London for a fresh start. 1936. Now that he was in London, John was in need of employment. He came across a posting for a position as a chauffeur at a local amusement park. He applied, and he was hired on the spot by a man named William McSwan. Of course, John neglected to mention his criminal record. Aside from chauffeur duties, John also performed duties as a mechanic on the amusement park equipment. John and William became good friends, despite their employer-employee dynamic. Two things they had in common were a predilection for fast cars and fancy clothing. At one point, William introduced John to his parents. William's parents were quite taken with John, and he was so well-liked and capable, he was promoted to the role of manager at the amusement park. John left after a year because working for someone else became more than he could bear for long, even when his boss was someone he liked so much. Taking another turn at self-employment, John opened a shop and offered his services as a solicitor. He used the name of another company, a company with a stellar reputation, to identify his own operation. As he was getting this company off the ground, he would lie and say that he had an estate he was able to liquidate, and that he had public shares he was anxious to offload. John received checks from his clients for goods he was assumed to provide in good faith, but he didn't. When these clients came knocking after realizing they were bilked, he would close the shop down and reopen elsewhere. He was unable to keep up the swindle for long, and soon he was behind bars once again. John was sentenced to 4 years in prison for fraud. When he was released, he was returned to prison after a year for theft. He would have been able to lie his way out of it if it hadn't been for his record of fraudulent activity. During his time in prison, John High devised a new scheme to make money through fraudulent means without getting caught. His new idea involved targeting older, wealthy women. He would employ his charm and wit at a time when these women were lonely and yearning for companionship. This plan didn't just involve marrying them and depleting their bank accounts after winning their trusts. To do so would include leaving a witness behind. No. He decided the only way to bury his tracks was to murder these women. He was willing to do so to ensure he enjoyed the standard of living he coveted and avoid going back to prison. In either case, he felt entitled, and he was a ruthless go-getter without a conscience. So he became determined to act on this plan as soon as he was released from prison. There was a metal shop in the prison where inmates learned practical skills and worked during their stay. John found out that sulfuric acid was used there on a regular basis. He learned how to use the substance skillfully and without injury to himself. Soon, sulfuric acid factored into his plan to bleed others of their assets. Eager to find out just how much acid it would take to dissolve a body, John enlisted the help of his fellow inmates to instruct him. They demonstrated with mice. He learned that it takes a half hour to make a mouse disappear without a trace using this method. Now he knew he had hatched the perfect plan. 1943. John High was released from prison. He was legit for a while, working as an accountant for an engineering firm. For months he stayed out of trouble, but his master plan for making money his way was on the boil, and he was eager to get started. Summer 1944. John High ran into William McSwan by happenstance. They were happy to see each other and had a few drinks at a pub. William invited John to see his parents, who were also happy to see John. During the visit, William's parents told John about some property-related investments they made. The property would be bequeathed to William one day. John was champing at the bit to get at that property and all it's worth. In order to do so, he would have to take care of their son, and not in the sense that they intended. On another occasion, John and William met at a pub on September 9th. By this time, John was renting a workshop and invited William to have a look. Once they were in the workshop, William got an eyeful of the place. While he was distracted by that, John picked up a blunt object and struck William in the head. To ensure his untimely death, he slit his throat. He wasn't exactly about to let the blood go to waste. He filled a cup with it and croaked it down. His teeth stained red and dripping with crimson drool. He came as close as anybody would at that time to being a vampire. John placed William's corpse in a 40-gallon drum and filled it with sulfuric acid. The fumes were too toxic and nauseating to be inhaled, so he stepped outside until they were settled. Once the fumes had cleared, he placed a lid on the drum. The next day, John went back to the workshop to inspect the progress of the acid. Foreshadowing the handiwork of Jeffrey Dahmer by decades, William McSwan had been reduced to red sludge, just a lumpy liquid. John poured William McSwan's aqueous remains down a drain. The fact that he had successfully killed someone and disposed of the remains was euphoric in its impact. John visited William's parents and told them their son had run away and gone into hiding to avoid military conscription. He even sent them letters and other items that were purported to have been sent by William. Remarkably, they didn't suspect anything was amiss. July 2nd, 1945. John High executed the next phase of his plan by executing Mr. and Mrs. McSwan. He killed them in the same way he did William, by striking them both about the head with a blunt object and slitting their throats to bleed them out. At death did they part. According to John, he positioned himself to drink blood on tap from both their throats. There is no evidence of him having done so, but who would lie about something like that? He brought them back to his workshop somehow. 2 drums of sulfuric acid awaited them. He put them both in the barrels and waited for them to dissolve. This wasn't the hardest part of the murders. He had his method of slaughter down pat. It would be much harder to come up with an explanation as to why they disappeared. It's easier to concoct a cover story for an individual. What do you say when a married couple goes missing together? He approached their landlady and informed her that the McSwans went on a trip to America. He told her that he had taken upon himself responsibility for accepting theirs and William's mail until they returned. In the meantime, John spent untold hours practicing the forgery of William's name. He also undertook the process of gaining power of attorney over the McSwans' financial affairs. He was able to collect and cash William's pension checks because of the ruse that William was in Scotland at the time. He forged a property deed that was owned by Mrs. McSwan and made almost £2,000 after selling it under a pseudonym. Not a bad payday, but it wasn't nearly enough for John High. He went about the business of selling all the McSwans' properties, possessions, and securities. Basically anything of value he could find. John High had now amassed a fortune of £6,000, approximately £325 in 2024 figures. John High was quite pleased with himself after having committed 3 murders with which he had gotten away scot-free and had lined his pockets with a small fortune. However, he wasn't known for being thrifty, and after living it up at the expense of the dead, he set his sights on a new victim. High realized that it would be foolhardy for him to keep his kill shop in one place for too long, so he set up a new workshop in another part of the city. This workshop was set up in the district of Sussex. He moved all his tools and barrels there, and it was well stocked with sulfuric acid. Oh, and blunt instruments? He wasn't short on them either. In 1947, John High met Dr. Archibald Henderson and his wife Rose through a property deal. When John saw that they were selling their house, he approached them to learn more about their financial status. He was prepared to offer them more than what the house was worth if he had to. The Hendersons were impressed by John, having been taken in by his charm. They found it easy to trust him. Though they were not as well off as the McSwans, they had enough money and property to feed John High's avarice. February 1948. John High met with the Hendersons again, and by then he set his sights on them as his freshest victims. He was a deadly predator, striking his victims unawares and breaking down their anatomy with sulfuric acid as his venom. It appeared that killing them at the same time would not be as easy as it was with the McSwans. Though not stated for the record, it could have been that they were younger and therefore more able to fight him off. Henceforth, he decided to take them out separately. He realized that it would be most prudent to kill Dr. Henderson first, since the male was the party most likely to retaliate. High informed the good doctor that he had invented something and that he really should take a look at it, and they were off to the workshop. As soon as they entered the workshop, High employed his newfound execution tool and shot the doctor with his revolver, which he had stolen from the Hendersons' house. Phase 2. He placed the doctor in a barrel and gave him an acid bath. John went back to his hotel and informed Rose that her husband had unexpectedly fallen ill and that she must rush to his side. They departed for the workshop. Almost as soon as they entered the workshop, John pulled out the revolver and shot Rose. He placed her in a drum of acid without delay. Husband and wife dissolved side by side inside matching barrels in holy matrimony. Eventually, John George High would become known as the Acid Bath Murderer. John returned to the couple's hotel and paid their bill to create the impression that they had departed elsewhere under normal circumstances. He entered their room and gathered up all items he could sell. He wrote a letter in which he claimed to be Dr. Henderson and sold everything they owned, amounting to £8,000, £365,000 in 2024 figures. Oddly, he kept the couple's dog, which to this day has gone without explanation. He sent a letter to Rose's brother, claiming that the doctor performed an abortion, and because the procedure was illegal in England at the time, the couple left for South Africa as fugitives. He gave some of Rose's clothing to his girlfriend. Naturally, he didn't tell her where it came from. High was getting sloppy with the disposal of evidence. When he poured out the drum containing Rose's liquefied remains, one of her feet was still intact. He was cocky at this point, believing he was above the law and would never get caught. February 1949. Never one to be frugal, John High had not only spent all the money on pleasurable and recreational pursuits, but he developed a gambling habit. The money he stole from the Hendersons would have kept him going for years if he had budgeted carefully, but that was not his way. At the hotel where he was staying, John High became acquainted with a woman named Mrs. Olive Durand Deacon. She was a 69-year-old widow who had lived at the hotel for 6 years. She and High were courteous with each other, exchanging in small talk and pleasantries at dinner time. He convinced her that he was an engineer and inventor. She appeared to be wealthy, for she was always clad in fur coats and bedecked with jewels. She was a vintage High victim. Olive was ahead of her time. One day she told John about this idea she had for false fingernails. She was looking for an engineer and inventor to make them so they could be marketed. High said he would think about it. February 18th. High invented Olive to his workshop. He told her he had been developing the false fingernails. As soon as the door closed behind her, John shot her in the head. He wasn't about to waste her fur coat and jewelry by dumping them into a vat of acid. He stripped her of all the materials he considered to be more valuable than her life. Thereupon, he put her in a barrel of acid. Olive was reported missing by a friend 2 days later. To create the impression of innocence, John High approached Olive's friend Constance to inquire about her whereabouts. When he found Constance to be no repository of relevant information, he volunteered to drive her to the police station to file a report. John High was questioned about Olive's disappearance, along with everybody else at the hotel where they were staying. He told investigators that he had arranged a rendezvous with Olive for the day of her disappearance, but she hadn't turned up. He hadn't considered that this claim would make him one of the focal points of the investigation as far as suspects were concerned. When he accompanied Constance to the police station, one of the officers felt John was suspicious, despite the lack of evidence. She did some digging and discovered his record of offenses. In the meantime, he emptied out the drum containing Olive's dissolved body. He emptied his pockets of all her jewelry, selling it all. When John returned to the hotel, he was shocked to find the police there. They interrogated him, and he gave them the same story about how he had arranged a meeting with Olive, but she hadn't shown up. The police saw no reason not to believe this story, and they left. The police returned to the hotel on Thursday to question High again. He told the same story about the rendezvous, though there were some details he added since the last time he told it. February 26th. The police broke into John's workshop to have a look. They found carboys, which are 10-gallon glass bottles with narrow necks. Some were empty, and some were half full of sulfuric acid. They also came across a rubber apron and a gas mask. Also discovered was the .38 revolver, which presented with signs that it had been fired recently. John's attaché case was left in the shop. They opened it up and found a dry cleaning receipt for a black Persian coat made of lambskin. They were aware that Olive owned one just like it. The police placed an ad in a newspaper asking for the merchant the jewelry was sold to, one Mr. Bowl, to come forward. He told police the jewelry was pawned the day after Olive went missing. It was taken to one of Olive's relatives, who verified that it had belonged to her. Mr. Bull identified John High as the man who pawned it, despite his having signed under an alias. February 28th, Detective Inspector Albert Webb went to the Onslow Court Hotel to invite John High to the police station to help with the investigation. John went with him voluntarily. March 1st, Dr. Keith Simpson, the Home Office pathologist, examined the scene at John High's workshop. He discovered some blood stains on the wall. When he took a close look at the drums, he found a hat pin at the bottom of one of them. From there, he took a close look at the backyard. In one corner of the yard, he came upon a pile of red sludge. He spotted what appeared to be a human gallstone within the sludge. He had a sample of the sludge collected for analysis at the lab. Evidence gathered from the sludge included the following items: 3 human gallstones, 28 pounds of human fat, 18 pieces of human bone, portion of a left foot, dentures, both upper and lower, a lipstick container, red plastic bag handle, 2 vertebrae, a handbag, a notebook. Olive's dentist confirmed that the dentures had belonged to her. The bone fragments of a foot were reassembled and found to be a rightful fit for one of her shoes. It was now proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that Olive Duran Deacon was murdered and dissolved in acid. The police discovered some paperwork in the workshop regarding the financial affairs of the McSwans and the Hendersons. During questioning, John asked Inspector Webb if anybody would ever be released from the psychiatric hospital Broadmoor. Webb told him it wasn't something he was at liberty to discuss. John then told Webb that if he told him the truth, he wouldn't believe him. John went on to confess that he killed Olive Durand Deacon. From there, he admitted to killing William McSwan, his parents, and the Hendersons. He even disclosed that he had killed 3 other people the police didn't know about. The victims in question were a man named Max, a woman from Hammersmith, and a young woman from Eastbourne. The inspector cautioned John against confessing any further, but for some reason, nothing and nobody could stop John from telling his story. He said that after he killed Olive, he took a penknife and slashed her throat, draining her body almost entirely of blood, which he drank avariciously. Then he gave her the acid bath. He informed the inspector that the murders of the McSwans and the Hendersons were motivated by his vampiric thirst for blood, which was easily slaked under these circumstances, but never satiated for long. He said he only killed Mrs. McSwan because the body of Mr. McSwan hadn't produced enough blood to satisfy him. Speculation has it that the claims of drinking blood were made to uphold an insanity defense. The other 3 murders were never substantiated with evidence, so he could never be charged for them. July 18, 1949. John High's trial commenced. He would tell anyone who cared to listen that he didn't kill his victims for financial gain in hopes that killing for pleasure as a motive would put him in a psych ward. The trial attracted a great deal of publicity, and about 4,000 people tried to get a seat in the courtroom. The defense focused on developing an insanity plea. Perhaps buttressing this strategy, High spent most of the trial focused on a crossword puzzle. High pleaded insanity, noting that his penchant for drinking blood was the surest sign that he was not mentally well. A psychiatrist who interviewed High found that he was given to paranoia. However, he did believe that High knew from right and wrong. He admitted that he only interviewed High for about 2 hours. During that time, John admitted to drinking his own urine, certainly something that only a crazy person would do and confess to. He had never been witnessed doing so in prison, however. The prosecutor insisted that High's long-range planning and efforts to conceal the evidence were proof that he knew right from wrong, and that the crimes were premeditated. The trial just took about 24 hours, and the jury only deliberated for 17 minutes before reaching their verdict: guilty. John George High was sentenced to death. August 10th, 1949. John High was taken to the gallows and hanged. Part 2. Ayman Aziz. It was during his 16th year in Wolverhampton, England, that Ayman Aziz's reputation as a troublemaker had been established. He was a bully, but his tendency to harass people was not restricted to the hallways of his school and throw rocks up onto people's roofs. This he found amusing, though, as time would tell, it could only satisfy his penchant for mischief for so long. His neighbors sure had plenty to say about him. In an interview with a reporter representing the Daily Mail, they described Aziz as evil scum and his family as out of control. One resident said, "They are just trouble. You should ask some of the shopkeepers nearby. They used to have a right go at them for some of the stuff they did. There were arguments all the time. It's the usual thing. They didn't have any authority over the boy. They did not care what they did. That is my opinion. He used to throw things on the garage roof when they lived here. They were just out of control. He was trouble, and the parents could do nothing about it." In his spare time, he would also use drugs and had become addicted to pornography, the latter of which would eat up hours of his life on a daily basis. Ayman's parents had given up on him. They'd withdrawn him from school after it had become apparent that he was never going to apply himself. They tried homeschooling, but this also proved to be a waste of time. Ayman decided that he was only going to do what he wanted to do. There is a designation for youths like Ayman Aziz in Britain, NEET, which stands for Not in Education, Employment, or Training. The NEETs are adrift and, in most cases, willingly so. The NEET category emerged in the late 1990s, and its usage has spread to other countries such as Japan, South Korea, China, Serbia, Canada, and the United States. People who are struggling to find employment can also be classified as NEETs. Ayman Aziz was the poster boy for the NEET demographic. He lived with his parents and siblings on Mulstein Street in the Wolverhampton suburb of Whitmore Reens. It was 2 blocks away on Mulstein Street where another immigrant family that factors into this story resided. Carolina Valentiniani and her daughter Victoria Sokolova, with their patriarch husband Saidas Valentinas. They are originally from Lithuania. Victoria gave her parents a lot to worry about. At the age of 14, she was already having sex on a regular basis. She also drank alcohol and used drugs. She was a frequent no-show at school and was known to run away on occasion. At one point, she was sent to reside with her biological father in Northern Ireland, in hopes that in doing so she would be reformed. That 2-month period did nothing to reform her behavior. She returned to Wolverhampton in April 2018, no different than she had been before she departed for Northern Ireland. She fell back into her old ways. April 11th. Victoria received a message on Facebook Messenger. It was sent to her by Ayman Aziz. It caught her off guard. She had known him in the past, having socialized with him throughout the neighborhood, but they had lost touch with each other. In fact, she hadn't heard from him in months. Aziz proposed that they hook up that evening in West Park. He told her that he had some marijuana and they could get stoned together. Victoria ran this by her friends. They tried to talk her out of it. They noted that Aziz's behavior could be erratic and even threatening. This warning did not deter Victoria. She was a headstrong and fearless girl and would not be dissuaded when it came to doing whatever it was she wanted to do. She also couldn't pass up an opportunity to get high. She told Aziz that she would meet him at a location that was popular with the local disorderly youth. It was a wooden pavilion located next to the lake, nicknamed the Black House. Victoria was streetwise. She knew Aziz wasn't going to share his stash of cannabis with her purely in the spirit of generosity. He would expect sexual activity to some degree. She either didn't object to this idea or she assumed she could deflect his advances in the event of her lack of interest. Either way, she decided to go. CCTV cameras are common in England these days and are used by law enforcement when investigating crimes that are committed in public places. 2 hours after Aziz arrived with Victoria, he is seen departed from the park wearing a different pair of pants than the ones he wore upon his arrival. The next morning, Victoria was found unconscious in the park. She hadn't simply fallen asleep due to the tranquilizing effects of marijuana. She was dead. She was found by a pedestrian who was out walking his dog. Her corpse had been slung over a park bench. She was partially nude. Drag marks indicated that she had been pulled 150 yards across the grass to the bench. There was more evidence. Inside the pavilion, it looked as though a rainstorm of blood had blasted itself throughout. There was a pool of blood on the floor. There were splatters on the walls. After she was brutally raped, Victoria was struck on the head 20 times. She was hit so hard, her skull was fractured and her brain was exposed. Some of her teeth were knocked out. It was clear that she made some attempt to defend herself, for there were several wounds on her arms and hands. The weapon was assumed to be a hammer, though it was never found. The coroner speculated that it may have taken Victoria about an hour to perish from the injuries. There was nothing about the investigation that would present a challenge to the police. Victoria's friends knew where she was going that night and who she was meeting up with. CCTV footage showed Victoria and Aziz entering the park together. When confronted with this, Aziz said that he and Victoria had had consensual sex in the pavilion and that he left soon afterward. He said she had chosen to stay behind and was alive when he left. The police searched Aziz's house and found his cell phone in the back of his closet. Though he'd taken care to delete the texts he'd exchanged with Victoria, the phone company still had them on record. He also entered a web search that went, "How to delete your Facebook account permanently." He deleted all the messages he had exchanged with Victoria. Most damning of all, there was CCTV footage of him trying to discard his blood-soaked clothing. At his trial, Aziz submitted a not guilty plea. His attorney proposed that the real culprit was Victoria's stepfather, Sidus Valentinus. Apparently, Sidus's DNA had been found on Victoria's panties. It was later surmised that this was made possible when he made contact with a basket of laundry. Sidus was outraged by the suggestion that he had sexually abused and murdered Victoria. He characterized the accusations as, quote, unreasonable, unsubstantiated, and rude. Aziz's lawyer's next tactic was to draw upon Aziz's history with mental illness as a factor in his motivation to kill. After all, Aziz had been treated by the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service before the murder and was treated for depression and anxiety. His barrister implied that Aziz wasn't capable of killing, that he may only have been guilty of manslaughter. The evidence was stacked in favor of a guilty verdict, and that decision was reached unanimously by the jury. The judge sentenced Aziz to life in prison with no possibility of parole before he is to have served 19 years. During his incarceration, Aziz has been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He was also bullied and harassed after his fellow inmates found out he attacked a minor. Speaking of whom, Victoria's mother, Carolina, reported that her daughter had, quote, many beautiful plans for the future, learning how to drive, finishing school, buying her a beautiful prom dress. Many times I've asked why there are such terrible people on the earth. To realize you don't have your child anymore and never will again. Because she was my one and only daughter. Someone dared to raise his hand against her and take her away from me. Why? Part 3. The New Forest Massacre. September 1986. Joseph Cleaver, a retired publisher, and his wife, Hilda, were enjoying a family dinner with their son and his wife. Everybody was enjoying dessert, which was served by their housekeeper, Margaret Murphy, and they were in good spirits. Suddenly, 3 masked men burst into the room. 2 of them were wielding pickaxe handles. The third had a shotgun. One of the men ordered the women to remove their jewelry. He told the men to put their wallets and cash on the table. All 4 of them were taken upstairs, where they were tied up and gagged. Hilda Cleaver was bound to her wheelchair. The invaders ransacked the entire house over the course of an hour. Their haul included weapons owned by Joseph Cleaver. They also took a television, a VCR, and other smaller items. They were under the impression that there was a wall safe containing several thousand pounds. They were irate due to their inability to find the safe, so they went upstairs. The men gang-raped 46-year-old Wendy Cleaver, each patiently waiting his turn. Once this was done, one of the assailants wrapped a black ribbon around her neck and strangled her. The trio of bandits poured gasoline, 10 liters of it, on the carpets, curtains, and beds, as the victims watched helplessly, unable to break free from their bindings. One of the burglars, as he descended the stairs, threw a burning item into the master bedroom. Immediately the room burst into flames. The Cleavers, their son, his wife, and Margaret the housekeeper, all died in abject terror and excruciating pain as the flames ate them alive. Nobody discovered the smoldering remains of the house until the next day when other domestic staff arrived for their shifts. Because much of the house was built with concrete in its foundation, the house was not reduced to kindling. The family's dog was wandering about. Its face was bloody from having been beaten. The animal's injuries were so extensive and resistant to treatment that she had to be put down. There were 2 other dogs on the premises. Hilda Cleaver's long-haired Dachshunds. They were scratching at the door to a room. When the help opened the door, they found Wendy Cleaver. She was half naked and soaked in blood. The master bedroom was charred, with everything burned down to embers and ashes. The help tried calling the police, but the phone lines had been cut. They drove to the police station to file a report. The investigators found a letter from a family among Joseph Cleaver's correspondences. It was a reference for a couple named George and Fiona Stevenson. They applied for jobs as cooks and handyman at the Cleavers' residence. They responded to an ad Joseph placed in a local paper. They moved into a small cottage on the property, though they left by the middle of August, not long after they got settled. Fiona often fled the cottage because George had been beating her. When Joseph found out about George's abuse of Fiona, he was appalled, and he fired him. Taking this into consideration, the police began to entertain the possibility that George Stevenson was out for revenge. It turned out George Stevenson had a lengthy criminal record. Among the charges were burglary, fraud, theft, dishonest handling, drug possession, assault, and firearm offenses. During one of his arrests, he sprayed tear gas in an officer's face. Police went to the address written on the letter that had been received by Joseph Cleaver. At that point, a married couple lived there. They had known George Stevenson. He gave them the television and VCR he stole from the Cleavers. The items sat in the living room as they were being questioned by the police. Every police station in the country was asked to be on the lookout for George Stevenson. Soon he was on the television news, and his photo was on all major newspapers. He was designated armed and dangerous. When he and his accomplices left the Cleaver house, they had 2 double-barreled 12-bore shotguns, a single-barrel .410 shotgun, a .22 rifle, and 12 boxes of ammunition. George Stevenson was shocked when he saw his picture on television. He decided to turn himself in, though not before one last night of freedom spent in revelry. He drank and smoked pot with 2 young girls at a campsite. Having finished with this, he went to a payphone and called the police, telling them where he was. They went to pick him up. Stevenson's house was raided by police. His accomplices, George and John Daly, were there at the time, and they, too, were taken into custody. October 6th, 1987. All three defendants pled not guilty to 5 counts of murder. Stevenson and George Daly pleaded not guilty to rape, but John Daly pleaded guilty to rape and robbery. The prosecutor stated his firm conviction that George Stevenson was the mastermind behind the crime. To quote the prosecutor, "Precisely for that reason, it had to end in murder. If not, Stevenson risked identification from his voice, his shape, and possibly even recognition through his stalking mask. But Burgett House didn't die. It refused to collapse or go up in flames, as had been expected. They were not to realize that Burgett House is made entirely of concrete, and instead of the fire catching the floor and wooden joists and galloping through, it contained itself in one room. Thus, the following morning when the police and fire brigade came, they were able to see and have left to them all these grisly clues as to what had taken place, right the way down to the dinner table and the interrupted meal." Addressing the jury directly, he said, "I must warn you that the facts of this case are gruesome in the extreme." He pointed out that because of his time working for the Cleavers, Stevenson knew that they ate dinner at the same time every night, and that they always left a front door key on the porch every night until 9 p.m. Stevenson and his accomplices let themselves into the house at 8:30 that night with the key. The Cleavers' son Jason called while the crime was underway. He was puzzled when an unfamiliar man answered the phone and told him he could not speak to any of his relatives. Jason called a second and third time. The third time, the men forced Joseph Cleaver to answer the phone. He said his mother couldn't come to the phone because she was in bed with the flu. John Daly verified that not only was Mrs. Cleaver raped, but she was also savagely beaten. He described how it went down. "He just put them on the bed, but I knew what they were there for. To kill her. I turned her onto her face, slipped the cloth around her neck, and pulled tight. Her face went blue, and she died." According to John Daly, she was strangled for about 5 minutes. George Daly was recorded in interviews with police. A portion of that interview. "After putting some stuff in the car, I went back into the house, and it smelled of petrol. Stevenson came down the stairs and said they were all dead. I thought they were just going to be left tied up. He said we would have to burn the house, so I lit a fire lighter and threw it over the rail as I was on the stairs. There was no bang. It just went up in a big flash." He went on to describe the rape and murder of Wendy Cleaver. "I thought it was just going to be a robbery. I thought we would get thousands. I never thought I would have to do anything." Stevenson changed his story, insisting that he was only a getaway driver. Speaking of the Cleavers, he said, "I would not have harmed them. They were lovely people. They had been good to me." The Daly brothers' attorney wasn't having it. He said, "The only way out for you now is to blame the Daly brothers, to try and save your own wretched skin. You are a man with no conscience." George Daly testified that he witnessed Stevenson attack Wendy Cleaver while holding a shotgun. The prosecutor characterized the crime as a, quote, "holocaust." He pointed out that all men were equally guilty. He went on, "Is there one of them who is not guilty of robbery? Is there one who is not guilty of rape? And is there one of them who was not party to the mayhem, carnage, and murders that took place at Burgett House?" On the 17th day of the trial, the jury reached a verdict of guilty for all defendants after 5.5 hours. They were found guilty of rape. The next day, they voted unanimously on guilty verdicts for the murder charges. George Stevenson received 6 life sentences. He was not to be eligible for parole until he has served 25 years. Speaking conclusively, the judge said, "These murders were committed in circumstances of indescribable brutality and cruelty. You showed no mercy and deserve none." John Daly was given 7 life terms for rape, robbery, and the 5 murders. His brother George was convicted for manslaughter. Though there was no evidence that he had killed anyone directly, the judge pronounced him as unconcerned for human life. George Daly was sentenced to 22 years. Unbeknownst to George Stevenson, his long-suffering wife, Fiona, called the police after seeing his face on the evening news to report him as a prime suspect. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.